Hello and welcome to Ask an Atheist. My name is Rebecca Markert and I'm the legal director here at the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
And I'm Jayne, an attorney at FFRF. Today we're going to be talking about the death penalty and religious liberty issues that come up on death row. As always, if you have questions about our topic today, you can drop them in the comments below, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org.
We don't have any guests today. It's just going to be Ryan and me because we spent the last 2 weeks scrambling to put together an amicus brief for a case arising out of death row in Texas. Earlier this month, the Supreme Court stayed the execution of John Ramirez. Ramirez has asked that he not only be allowed a pastor inside his execution chamber, but also that his pastor be allowed to pray out loud and to lay his hands on him during the execution. This is the issue the Supreme Court will decide this November. But before we dig into that case and the arguments we put forth in that brief, we want to discuss the history of the death penalty in the U.S. and why FFRF has called for the abolition of the death penalty here in the United States.
So FFRF has repeatedly called for the abolition of the death penalty over the years. We proudly boast that in modern times, freethinkers have been the first to speak out for prison reform, for humane treatment of the mentally ill, for abolition of capital punishment, for women's right to vote, for death with dignity for the terminally ill, and for the right to choose contraception, sterilization, and abortion, just as they were the first to call for an end to slavery.
Yes, and FFRF regularly denounces the imposition of the death penalty for crimes, particularly blasphemy, around the world. FFRF has called for the United States to end the death penalty as well. Nearly 70% of FFRF's membership opposes the death penalty, and FFRF is actually based in Wisconsin, which was the first state in the nation to abolish the death penalty permanently for all crimes, way back in 1853.
And it's a biblically based punishment. The death penalty isn't solely from the Bible, but it's long been used to justify state-sponsored killings. For example, you can see in Genesis, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. And then in Romans, does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God to execute his wrath on the wrongdoer. And of course, there's the famous commandment from Exodus 21, which is, you are to take life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. And incidentally, that same chapter, Exodus 21, explicitly says that beating slaves is okay because slaves are your property, but it also says that if you beat your slaves so harshly that they lose an eye or a tooth, you have to set them free. So the whole eye for an eye thing doesn't apply to people you own, according to the God of the Old Testament. It actually says that slaves are worth exactly 30 shekels of silver. So there's some Old Testament moral guidance for you. But anyway, back to the death penalty.
So the death penalty has been around probably since the beginning of time, and it traveled from England to colonial America. We had capital punishment in the new colonies. The Puritans adopted their penal code largely from Mosaic law. In fact, 30 crimes that they included in that code were verbatim from the Torah. This included death for crimes like witchcraft, blasphemy, murder, adultery, and so forth. Now, during the Enlightenment era, there was a trend towards abolition. In fact, Thomas Jefferson wanted to abolish it for all crimes except for murder and treason, and he tried to get that passed in Virginia, but it was rejected. But since our founding, the trend toward abolition has continued, and up until 1972, that trend continued, and in fact, the Supreme Court did abolish the death penalty effectively in 1972 in a case called Furman versus Virginia, where it declared it unconstitutional under the 8th and 14th Amendments. Unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed course 4 years later in a case known as Gregg v. Georgia, where they decided that it would be constitutional to have capital punishment so long as you had certain sentencing guidelines in place an appellate review, and a different process for capital cases.
So today it is a global embarrassment. The U.S. is among the top countries in the world for rates of execution, along with China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Egypt, South Sudan, and North Korea. And over the past couple years, the Supreme Court has considered death penalty cases these last-minute stays of execution that don't challenge the death penalty itself, but surprisingly that all involve the issue of allowing spiritual advisors in the execution chamber.
So let's set the stage here, because there's been a surprisingly large number of cases involving this issue, whether spiritual advisors can be in the execution chamber, just over the last 2 years. So the first case that we're going to discuss is Dunn v. Ray. That case came about in February of 2019. So Ryan, why don't you tell us a little bit about that case?
Sure. So in this case, this was a Muslim inmate who was requesting an imam to be in the execution chamber with him. And Alabama said, no, you can't have an imam. You have to have a Christian person with you. If you want to have Christian clergy, that's fine, but Muslim clergy, that's not acceptable. And the Supreme Court said that the state rule was okay, which correctly, understandably caused a lot of outrage that they let that execution go ahead without giving him a spiritual advisor who was of his faith.
And the dissenters in that case actually pointed out that that policy that the state of Alabama had was unconstitutional under the Establishment Clause because it gave preference to Christian clergy and no other clergy was allowed to be present.
Yeah, obviously, just blatantly unfair in
Right.
favor of Christianity over Islam.
Right, so just a month later, this issue comes up again out of Texas, and the Supreme Court takes a look at it in the Murphy versus Collier case. Can you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yes, so this was a Buddhist inmate in this case, and similar question. He wanted a Buddhist spiritual advisor, and this time the Supreme Court, maybe reeling from all the backlash from the prior case, took a different route where they said, okay, if the state of Texas is going to offer Christian clergy in the execution chamber, they can't exclude Buddhist clergy just because it's a different religion. So in this case, they said that Murphy was allowed to have a Buddhist priest in the execution chamber with him. And the question, the obvious question when these two cases are 1 month apart is, what was the difference between the two? So do you want to say what was the Supreme Court's explanation?
I think that they realized that they had a mistake. They had made a mistake, and there was such outrage over this earlier decision that they wanted to correct the course. But I think the actual technical reasoning behind it was procedural. That the plaintiff, the Muslim death row inmate, had actually made his request too late, and Murphy had put his request in way earlier.
It's an incredible thing, and this is kind of, I think, an early little precursor of where we're going to go with our brief, where it's like, when I remember reading that, and I just thought, this is insane, that you're saying, oh, sorry, you filed your paper a little bit too late, so we're going to go ahead and kill you. That's just a crazy thing for a Supreme Court justice to say.
Absolutely. So after this case, Texas changes its policy entirely, and they decide that you can't have any spiritual advisors in the chamber at all, which is basically what Kavanaugh said in the earlier case, that this was a problem, but you could also fix this by not allowing anybody at all.
Yep, and so that's what Texas decided to do. They said, all right, we'll take you at your word, Justice Kavanaugh, we will not allow any spiritual advisors in. And so then there was in Gutierrez, a Catholic death row inmate who said that he thought he had a free exercise right to have a Catholic priest in there with him. And he argued that the ban on spiritual advisors violated his free exercise of religion. And the Supreme Court listened to that and said that what they did is they remanded it to the lower courts to say, why don't you take a closer look at this and see if this is really a threat to the safety of the procedure, or if not, then under the Free Exercise Clause and also a law called Arlupa, then you have to allow him to have the spiritual advisor. So they're starting to consider the idea that maybe these death row inmates do have a right to have a spiritual advisor with them as long as it's not dangerous.
So it's not the end, though. So we go back to Alabama earlier this year, in February of 2021, in a case Dunn versus Smith. Do you want to talk a little bit about that one? Yeah, and so this one was sort of a confirmation of the policy I was just discussing, where Alabama similarly banned all spiritual advisors from the execution chamber, and he sued over that policy, and the Supreme Court said, yes, if there is, again, no danger, then you have to provide a spiritual advisor on request inside the execution chamber. That's right. So then this brings us back to the Ramirez case. Back to Texas again. This is always Alabama or Texas for this particular issue. And so the issue in Ramirez is whether he can have a spiritual advisor in the room with him, but also that pastor can pray out loud and lay his hands on Ramirez while the execution takes place. We actually have a news clip about this case that will dive into it a little bit more.
Now he and his attorney allege a Texas state prison intends to violate his First Amendment right of freedom of religion. In a federal lawsuit, his lawyer Seth Kretzer says the Texas Department of Criminal Justice won't allow Ramirez's pastor, Dana Moore, to put his hands on him during the execution, something Kretzer says is an important part of Ramirez's faith.
The prison doctor needs to be touching the person as they're executed, and yet the state of Texas tells us that a spiritual advisor cannot exercise his religion in the same way.
So the Supreme Court stays his execution at the beginning of September, and arguments are set to be held November 1st. Briefs on this case from Ramirez and from parties like us were due this past Monday. We filed our amicus brief along with American Atheists and the American Humanist Association. Our brief was in support of neither party, but we did want to bring to the court's attention a few different things. And Ryan, what were those things?
So we took the stance, first of all, that the death penalty is unconstitutional. And I wanted to take a moment to notice, and I double-checked this morning, that we are the only group arguing against this guy getting executed at all, which is kind of incredible to me. So it was a funny kind of hodgepodge of groups that weighed in, all in favor of Ramirez. And
a lot of religious organizations are weighing in, religious organizations that have officially been in support of abolishing the death penalty.
Right, and I would think, I've never been religious, but I would think if I were a Christian, for instance, that my first thought would be to go to the Supreme Court and say, thou shalt not kill, we should probably end state-sponsored killings, but that's not their argument. They're all just saying you should let the priest, the spiritual advisor lays their hands on the guy right before you kill them. So we took the first argument that the death penalty is unconstitutional, and you focused on what the traditional arguments have been against that, particularly the Eighth Amendment. Do you want to speak a little bit about that?
Right. So I really concentrated on the Eighth Amendment. It was the crux of the decision back in 1972, where they really took a look at the Eighth Amendment and said the ban on cruel and unusual punishment includes the death penalty. At the heart of the Eighth Amendment, the spirit of the Eighth Amendment is that we want to preserve human dignity. And to exterminate someone's life by the hand of the state is to abase that human dignity. And that's really the crux of the argument we were saying there. It was kind of more of a humanist argument that the death penalty goes against all human rights.
Yeah, and again, that won the day in 1972, but then just 4 years later, they took another look and changed their mind on that. So in a sense, the sad reality is that unless they change their mind again, which they could, that ship has sailed. So that's why we were trying to get creative about thinking, is there another way to approach this? So credit goes to our co-counsel Patrick Elliott, who pointed out an absurdity in this recent string of cases where the court is getting ever more scrutinizing about religious liberty, the smallest little details. And this also makes you think back to other recent free exercise cases like the Hobby Lobby case and Little Sisters of the Poor. So these are not death penalty cases, but they're cases where the Supreme Court is just showing hypersensitivity toward religious liberty, where things like in the Little Sisters case, is a company that gets a religious exemption from a law to provide insurance coverage to their employees, and all they have to do is fill out a one-page form with 5 blanks on it, and they say filling out this form violates our religious liberty. And the Supreme Court signs on to the idea that, oh yes, this is abhorrent. We have to protect your religious liberty. We can't make you fill out this form. That would be crazy. And now in the prison context case, they're looking at these end-of-life accommodations where you have spiritual advisors, and they're looking first at, can they be in the execution chamber or do they have to be on the other side of the glass? And they say, yeah, you have to let them into the execution chamber. And now they're trying to figure out the even more microscopic point of, are they allowed to touch you, or do you have to have is a no touching rule okay, which is what Texas wants. And we pointed out that if you take a step back, if you're serious about protecting religious liberty, and you're saying that the only time that you're allowed as a state to violate religious liberty in any way is if it's absolutely essential for safety and protection, then you should really take a fresh look at this whole practice, because it's a pretty simple argument, right? There's a 2-step question here. The first question is, does executing someone violate their religious liberty? And it's pretty hard to say no, right? Killing someone is much more offensive to their religious liberty, stops them from
all their constitutional rights, really.
All of them, yeah. You obliterate all of their rights because you're obliterating the person. So imagine, Ramirez might have a Bible study he goes to next week, and if the jail went in and said, you're not allowed to go to your Bible study next week, that would be a First Amendment violation. Killing him also prevents him from going to the Bible study, right? So it should be crystal clear. Yes, this violates his religious liberty. Of course it does. And so then the next question is executing him necessary for prison safety? And the answer is absolutely no. There's no question. One of the things that comes to mind for me is it wasn't until law school that I learned that executing people is vastly more expensive than keeping them alive, which I had assumed the opposite when I was younger, but that's the reality of it. People are on death row for so long. It's such a torturous experience, and it's endless litigation. It's incredibly expensive. So if we abolish the death penalty, states would save so much money that if you have any legitimate concerns about, like, well, here's, this serial killer who is going to be in the prison, they could harm other people. Okay, well, how many guards could you hire if you saved this much money? So there's no way that you can really argue that this is necessary for safety or danger considerations. So that's our argument, is that if the Supreme Court wants to be consistent about protecting the religious liberty of death row inmates, it is just incomprehensible that they can say at the last minute you have to do these little tiny tweaks to protect their religious liberty, but then you can go ahead and kill them in a state-sponsored killing.
Really, it's the absurdity of the fact that we're arguing about this. Like, what constitutional rights should we afford this person who we're going to kill a minute later?
Yeah.
And Justice Breyer has pointed out this absurdity, that we spend a lot of time trying to figure out exactly how we can guarantee constitutional rights right up to the point where we execute them and take away their constitutional rights forever. And it's a strange paradox that the court is engaging in. And Justice Breyer, in fact, is one of the justices that currently sits on the court who is in favor of reopening this question that came up in the 70s of whether the death penalty is constitutional.
Yeah.
And in fact, it seems like they have 4 votes to abolish the death penalty, which is another reason why we wanted to bring this up, because I think, personally, they do have 5 votes. They could get 5 votes if they reopened this question.
And who do you think, if you're going to play prophet here, who do you think the 5th vote is going to be?
Thank you for setting that up, Brian. I think it's going to be Justice Barrett. And you dug into her background pretty significantly when we were vetting her for her nomination just last year. So why don't you tell us a little bit why we kind of think that Justice Barrett might be the 5th vote here?
Sure. So the thing with Barrett is that the reason that everyone was so upset with her nomination, one of the reasons, is that there was very strong evidence that she was going to be a vote for overturning Roe v. Wade, which we've confirmed since then. And the reason that that was so clear is that she had this law review article that she wrote about how Catholic judges could rule. And the question was basically, could Catholic judges rule against their conscience? And her conclusion was no, they shouldn't. They're a Catholic first and they're a judge second. They cannot suspend that religious belief in order to rule according to the law, which is horrible. When you're thinking about reproductive rights, you read that, you think, okay, please don't make this person a judge. Definitely don't make them on the Supreme Court justice. But the interesting thing is that that law review article was actually not about abortion. It was about the death penalty. And so she was specifically asking the question of, as a Catholic judge who is opposed to the death penalty, could you rule to have someone executed? And her conclusion was no, you would have to recuse yourself from the case. So she wasn't saying that, this is how in her confirmation here, she tried to dance around the issue. She kind of said, well, it's not that you have to rule in opposition to the law. It's just that you would recuse yourself and let another judge who's not conflicted rule on it. But here she's on the Supreme Court. So I don't think she's going to recuse herself from the issue. No. And so the question is she going to be a vote in favor of abolishing the death penalty? And I think you're right that there's a real shot. It's
probably not going to happen in this case. So realistically, right. They are going to discuss the free exercise and RLUIPA claim. And RLUIPA is the statute, federal statute, Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. Mm-hmm. We always just call it RLUIPA here in the office. And so that's at the crux of the case. But knowing that, our asking them to abolish the death penalty is probably not going to happen, we did have a final argument in that brief about what it should look like in the execution chamber with regard to spiritual advisors. Why don't you tell them what that was?
Yeah, so the other issue that you may have noticed as non-religious people listening to this string of cases is that these are all religious inmates who get a spiritual advisor who is someone who's in the execution chamber with them at the end of their life. And so the question might arise, what if this person was not religious and they also don't want to die alone, which kind of seems like a pretty fair, universal human trait. If they go in and say, I would like to have my counselor in the execution chamber with me, if the state of Texas says, no, absolutely not, this is not a spiritual advisor, so you can't have them in the room with you, that would be it would be manifestly unfair, and we made the argument that would violate the Establishment Clause because it favors religion over non-religion, which the Supreme Court has repeatedly and clearly said is not acceptable, and it has a coercive effect. If you were on death row and you don't want to be executed alone, you just might find religion because that is your ticket to have someone in there with you. So what we did is we told the Supreme Court, if you are not going to revisit the constitutionality of the death penalty itself, you at least need to craft a rule that is inclusive and fair so that end-of-life accommodations on death row are applied evenly regardless of what the person's religion is and regardless of whether the person is religious or not.
Right. Goes back to that question of human dignity, in my opinion, that everybody at the end of their life should have somebody with them, some source of comfort.
Yep.
So what do you think the court is going to do here?
My prediction, sadly, I don't, as you said, I don't think it's likely that they're going to revisit the constitutionality of the death penalty in this case. Actually, just yesterday, it wasn't a religious liberty case, but they let an execution go on yesterday in Texas. So they're not chomping at the bit to stop these executions, unfortunately. So I think they probably are going to allow it to take place. But I would predict that they're going to rule in Ramirez's favor in this particular issue and say that the spiritual advisor is allowed to pray audibly and to lay hands on him. So I think that's the most likely result.
See, I agree. I think that they are definitely going to rule in favor of granting more religious privilege. That it seems to be the trend from this court. But I disagree that he's going to be allowed to lay his hands on him. I think they are going to find that that is a security risk. So I think that he's going to be allowed to pray, but he's not going to be allowed to touch him during the execution.
It's definitely possible. There is an interesting amicus brief that another one that was filed in addition to ours that was from former prison officials. And their argument went to that point where they were basically saying, we've participated in these before, and we do not think that this presents a danger, a security risk. So yeah, we'll see. And the other thing too is it's something a legal principle this court has ignored in the past. So maybe you're right that they'll ignore it again. Is that it's supposed to be for lower courts to decide factual questions like this. Is this a security risk? Appellate courts are supposed to just trust the lower courts on those issues unless they're obviously clearly wrong and just rule on issues of law. But this court in the past has said, no, we're just going to go ahead and take a fresh look at the facts, even though that's not supposed to be our role. So you might have a point that they might just look at that and trust the state and say, yeah, this sounds like a security risk.
Yeah. Was there anything else you want to say before we take questions?
No, I think we're ready for questions.
All right. We do have a number of questions here. So Jayne Laney asks, what if an atheist or agnostic wanted someone like their spouse or parent in the execution chamber instead of a spiritual advisor? If they say no, would that be a lack of religious discrimination against that person for their lack of belief?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and probably the question came in right before we hit that topic. So that was in our brief where we specifically said you can't discriminate against atheists and non-religious people. But I do think that even though I do think that is required, that there be an even-handed approach, I would suspect that the Supreme Court would draw the line at least at family members. I think that the state probably has a pretty compelling argument that having a spouse or a parent or a child in the execution chamber is a different and heightened risk compared to having a spiritual advisor or a counselor. So I think it would have to be very likely a secular counterpart to a spiritual advisor. I think that if it's just too much to expect that a parent would allow their child to be executed in the same room with them, I would expect that the Supreme Court would listen to a state that says that we're not going to let that happen.
It's also a discussion that we had with the legal team when we were talking about who should be there.
Yeah.
So another question, Lee Hennessy, comment and question. So she writes, honestly, I've never thought of capital punishment as an inherently religiously based thing. That said, I'd be interested to know what people think about prisoners who would request the death penalty. Should they be able to choose death as opposed to life in prison?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I honestly haven't really thought about that before. I mean, it kind of, we strongly support the sort of right to die, what used to be called assisted suicide, but death with dignity bills. But this is the idea that if you're terminally ill, you should be allowed to choose the manner in which you die by dying humanely instead of being forced to let terminal disease run its course when you know that you're terminal. But yeah, if you have someone who is serving life in prison and they don't want to and they want to be executed, I don't know. It's a good question.
It is a good question. It makes me think of the line of cases where people chose their method of execution, by firing squad. And I know that those have been litigated in some manner, but I don't know how they turned out.
Yeah.
If you get to choose how you get killed.
That reminds me of the scene from Monty Python's Meaning of Life, I believe it was, where there's a man who gets to choose the manner of his own execution, and I won't describe the scene because it's not appropriate, but it's very funny.
All right, so Heather Johnson asks, do staff that participate in these executions have any PTSD issues? I don't understand how humans can participate in this with no mental and emotional trauma. And I actually don't know the answer to that. I assume that there is literature out there, and there's probably briefs that have been submitted in other death penalty capital punishment cases to that effect, especially if they were arguing that this was unconstitutional and cruel and unusual punishment and the effects that has on other people. But I don't actually know the studies or the data. Do you know any of that?
I don't. Yeah, it's another wonderful question and not something that I came across in researching for this case.
Right, and so obviously this is not in our wheelhouse, the death penalty. There are lawyers who practice this day in and day out. In fact, one of my friends I contacted about this when we decided we wanted to jump in on this case because of the religious liberty issues and talk about whether the death penalty was constitutional. They will probably be better equipped to answer some of these questions. But we did limited research to these specific arguments. So the next question, John Allen. In many cases, the use of the word punishment is suspect. Do we punish a dog that has a history of attacking people? No. We end its life out of concern for other people, for our safety. So are you against putting rabid animals down too?
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, so the short answer is no. I would not be strongly opposed to putting rabid animals down. I mean, to take the question literally, rabies is one of the most deadly, horrific diseases out there. And so if you have an animal with rabies, it's a huge threat to everything around it, and it's a miserable experience to have rabies. So that's kind of an easy one, I guess, on that literal question. But the issue of punishment it's a really interesting point, and I think it goes to, why do we have the death penalty? And there's a number of arguments that are usually articulated for it, and one is a matter of just sort of retribution, which I think is getting to the question there, where it's like, this is punishment. It's like, you did this thing and we are retaliating against you. It's the eye for an eye idea, and that, I think, is the issue that as non-religious people we ought to be objecting to. Of course, atheists have a huge diversity of moral beliefs, so we could argue about this all day, but to my mind, most humanists, I think, would say it is not a morally acceptable thing to say, because this person killed someone, I think it's justified to kill them. And then the other arguments, the other things you might call punishment, what's the point of the punishment, are things like deterrence. So people say, well, we have the death penalty because it will lead to less murders.
And actually, that is the next question.
Okay.
From Chelsea Valea, who writes, capital punishment is a great deterrent that stops a lot of crime. Why would you want to get rid of an effective deterrent?
Yes, so wonderful. I just queuing it right up there. So this is another thing that when I was younger, I thought the exact same thing. I thought that was a very reasonable thing. And it turns out that there has been a lot of research done on this, and it is not an effective deterrent. You would think it would be, but the number of people who decide not to go forward with a murder because they're facing the death penalty rather than life imprisonment is virtually nil. The reality of the situation is that when you have these horrible crimes being committed, the person is either not expecting to get caught, or they are simply not thinking about the consequences when they're doing what they're doing. So that seems to be the reason that, even though it sounds good on paper that this has a huge deterrent effect, we have learned through research that is actually not the case.
Right. Exactly. I mean, there's a whole host of other issues that the death penalty presents, including the racial injustice of it all, and the arbitrariness of who gets the death penalty and who doesn't, and how race is affected by that. Those are issues we did not go into in the brief because
not to mention, sorry to cut you off, not to mention that we know for a fact that we have executed innocent people in this country.
Right.
And so people who've been exonerated by DNA evidence after the fact, that you at least, I would think, if you're a pro-capital punishment person, you at the very least should say that if you have a person who is denying that they did this crime, you cannot execute them. That is just unacceptable. There's supposed to be a high bar when you convict someone for murder, but it's not as high as it is supposed to be in a way. It's supposed to be beyond a reasonable doubt, and that has obviously not always been the case.
Right, right. We've spent a lot of time talking about how we can make the death penalty constitutional, and I really think it just ends with maybe it's not, after all. Maybe there is no constitutional way to kill someone. So the James Allen just has a comment, and this will be the last. I know this is generating a lot of debate, I think, in our Facebook comments. But James Allen writes, just to end the show, for those not in favor of abolishing the death penalty, how many people are required to decide it's okay to kill someone? One person? Of course not. 2 people? What about 3 people? Should 3 people be able to decide someone should die? I think not. But somehow we get 300 million people together and call it a country, and all of a sudden it's morally and ethically fine to decide to kill someone. I don't understand that way of thinking.
Yeah, well said.
Well said. So that's it for our show this week. Check out some of our other shows. You can watch Free Thought Matters on TV stations around the United States on Sunday mornings. This week's guest is author and columnist for The Nation, Katha Pollitt. Check out our website for stations and times, and don't forget to tune in to Free Thought Radio. The website is up there for that show. And while you're on our website, why don't you become a member?
FFRF.org. And that is our show. That is Ask an Atheist this week. We hope to see you next week.